We are so excited that you're here. We are at the end of this series that we've been doing, talking about how we view ourselves and who God made us to be. And so we're talking about, in a way, self-esteem. And so we have wrapped this whole series around one of my favorite Christmas movies, Elf. And so, of course, we're calling it Elf-esteem. And so we've identified self-esteem as simply the reflection that you have of yourself and how you see yourself. And so, can you take that? Our theme scripture for this series, it has been Proverbs 23:7, where Solomon, one of the wisest men ever to be, said this. It's a very simple phrase. It's a very powerful phrase. And he said this. He says, as he thinks, or some translation says, as a man thinks within himself, so is he. And we walk away from that understanding that it matters how we see ourselves and how we think within ourselves, because it determines who we are. See, our view of ourselves determines who we are. And so we say it this way, that we will never go beyond the self-portrait that we have of ourselves. That was the first week. And so it's very important, the self-portrait that we have and how we view ourselves, because we'll never be able to grow beyond that. Solomon says that is actually going to make us who we are, is how we think. And regardless of our calling, our destiny, that we're constantly going to be limited by our view of ourselves. And then last week, Tammy, one of our pastors here, did an amazing job at talking about how to overcome when bad things happen to us. That many times that determines our view of ourselves when bad things happen. And we found out that our value isn't determined by anybody's ability to see it other than God. And so it's so important that we see ourselves through God's eyes. And so if you didn't get either one of those messages, you can go to our website, lwfc.org, or you can catch us on YouTube and watch those messages if you'd like to. So here's the thing that makes Christmas so wonderful and sometimes so terrible. Now, it's mostly wonderful, but sometimes there are things that create tension in Christmas. Sometimes Christmas can exaggerate all the bad, but then also it can also point us towards something very wonderful. Because Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but it's not the most wonderful time of the year necessarily because of what is actually happening around us at this point. It is the most wonderful time of the year, but it's not because of what's happening. See, Christmas can be very complicated sometimes. Do you know that? Sometimes it can even be dark. Because sometimes there are hurts that we've never been healed from. There have been expectations that we can't meet, and there are situations that we just don't understand. And the wonder of Elf, even though it's fictitious and sometimes a little outrageous, is that we can relate to a lot of the things that Buddy goes through within the movie. Let's take a look at this first clip.
Hey! What's your name? My name's Buddy. Does someone need a hug? I just wanted a hug!
So, Buddy is just trying to help this raccoon that seems to be having a hard time, a hard day, reaching out, trying to show some friendship, give a hug, and he gets attacked. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been hurt by somebody that you were actually trying to help, or you were trying to be there for them, and they turned and attacked you? Yeah, I've been there. Got the scars to prove it. Because the truth is that hurt people, right? And the people that we try to help usually are people that are hurt. So it's kind of inevitable. And so Christmas can be kind of complicated because sometimes we have hurts. We have wounds that maybe we've never healed from. And a lot of times the people we have to see at Christmas are the authors of those wounds. Sometimes your own wounds can be part of your own regret. Maybe other people have forgiven you, but they've got over it. but you still carry that around with you. And then there are situations where loved ones are not there at Christmas, that, to be honest, we weren't entirely ready to let go of them. And so there's those pains that can also be there. And we sometimes we never heal from those pains and those hurts, and they're still there at Christmas. Another reason that Christmas can be very complicated, and sometimes even dark, is that there are people that have expectations of us that we just can't meet. We can't live up to. In the movie, Buddy is mistaken for an employee at a department store because he's dressed like an elf. And he desperately wants to meet those expectations, and he's excited. He gets to work in the toy division that they call the North Pole. And you would think that the expectation is to be excited about Christmas, but it wasn't. Take a look at this real quick. And so obviously, excitement about Christmas was not necessarily the expectation there. So Christmas can be complicated not only because of hurts that never heal, but also because of expectations that you don't maybe feel like you can meet. And sometimes, to be honest, we don't even know what the expectations are. For example, Melissa and I, when we got married, we realized very quickly that our families celebrate gift giving much different. And so in Melissa's family, when you give somebody a gift and they open it, they're thankful for that gift. They say, "Thank you, I appreciate that." In my family, when somebody gives you a gift, regardless of what it is, you over-exaggerate your thankfulness. "Oh, wow, thank you, this is amazing. I've always wanted an airwax candle. It's awesome." And so you kind of go overboard. Regardless, it's a family culture thing. So you can see how the expectations might be odd when I open up some socks from Melissa's parents, and I'm like, "Wow, socks!" And they're wondering, what is wrong with this kid? And then when Melissa opens presents for my family, and she's like, "Thank you very much," and they're like, "Did she like her present? We don't know." And so sometimes the feelings of not being able to meet expectations can be amplified at Christmas, right? To feel like you don't measure up or you're not meeting expectations, that can be very confusing, and even it can put you in a dark place sometimes. And then sometimes we're the people that put expectations on other people that maybe they don't understand. Maybe it's a family culture, or maybe they just don't agree with those expectations. And so another reason that Christmas can be complicated, not only the hurts that you have and the expectations that you can't meet, but also just simple situations that, to be honest, we just don't get. We just don't understand. And so take a look at this. So when that doctor pricked Buddy's finger, he had no idea why this man is trying to hurt him, right? He didn't understand the situation. And sometimes in our lives, Christmas can be confusing and possibly dark, not only because we have hurts that we've never healed from or expectations we can't meet, but also those situations that we just don't understand. Thinking, why would that person do that? Why is this happening to me? Why would God allow this? And we have these situations that we don't understand that can be amazingly confusing. And like I said, even dark at times. And so to some extent, at some point within our lives, we all go through something like this. And so here's the thing. There are things that make Christmas wonderful, but then it can be terrible at times as well. And one of the things that creates tension at Christmas sometimes is it exaggerates and amplifies the bad, but then sometimes it points us to something that's actually amazing. So it is the most wonderful time of the year, but not because of what is happening. It is absolutely the most wonderful time of the year because what has happened in the past, our King. Right? So, see, at Easter we celebrate a one-time event, but at Christmas we celebrate a whole season, and we look forward to an event that changed everything, where God sent his Son into the world to become the center of history. But more important for you, more important for me, he sent his Son into this world to become the center of my life, of your life. And when Jesus becomes the center of our lives, it centers our lives on something stable, something hopeful, something that gives us a sense of purpose and destiny, a sense that I don't need fear, or although there are many things to fear. Yet there's this sense that Christmas is not so much the greatest time of the year because of who's with us, but it is the most wonderful time of the year. Because at Christmas, we are reminded who is for us. And the darker things get, and the more complicated things get, and at Christmas time, everything gets a little bit amplified. But at the same time, at Christmas time, we are able to focus on the light of the world that's come into the world to make an extraordinarily practical difference in each of our lives. Now, as you know, or if you grew up in church, at the beginning of the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there are 4 different accounts of Jesus' life. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their accounts are very similar, but John's is very, very different. And John, unlike Matthew and Luke, he doesn't give us a birth announcement. It doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus in the same way. It kind of gives us a different perspective. And the thing that is so vastly different about the Gospel of John is this. And again, if you read the Bible, you may or may not pick this up, or if you're new to church, you may just think that, the Bible is a bunch of stories. In fact, the Bible is actually history. But what makes John's Gospel so unique, especially at this time of the year, is that John wrote his Gospel. When he wrote it, he was a very old man. It was at the end of his life. In fact, most people think that his gospel was the latest gospel that was written out of all 4 of them. And when John sat down to write, we don't know this for sure, but it seems like from the writing that he was thinking I got to write this down because I don't have a lot of time left, and I want to make sure that these stories are passed on for future generations. I mean, could you imagine if you were somebody that sat at the feet of Jesus and you told these stories firsthand, how popular you would be with Christians? And so anytime John went anywhere, Christians would say, "John, tell us what it was like. We've heard the stories, but you were there." And so he probably told these stories many, many times. And so John is the person that boiled God down to a single word. He's the person that sat back. And he's just said, let me make this as simple and clear as possible. And God is, do you remember this? God is love. Right? That was John. And the thing that was so amazing about John saying that is because of what he had seen and what he had experienced in his life. See, he's very, very old when he's writing. And he has experienced loss like you and I could never imagine, no matter what your story is like. He's lost friends, he's lost family members, in some ways, he has lost his entire society and his whole culture. See, John was alive when Nero sent a general into Galilee and began to work his way through Galilee, rolling up all these Jewish cities and Jewish towns, slaughtering thousands and thousands of Jewish people, and sending thousands and thousands of men and women and children into the slave markets of Rome. See, John lived through that. He lived through the time when that general left his son outside of the city of Jerusalem to capture it. And John had spent many, many years in Jerusalem and experienced some amazing events in the city of Jerusalem. And he either saw that city surrounded, or perhaps he may have even been there for the 7 months when people starved to death and plagues broke out, and the Roman army built a ditch and a wall all the way around the city, trying to get inside to the city. And at the end of that Jewish war in 70 AD, John was either there or he heard the stories about the temple being burnt to the ground, his temple, and over 1 million Jews slaughtered. Over 200,000 or 300,000, some people say, slaves that were taken from the city of Jerusalem, this precious city, and flooded the Roman slave market. And so by the time he had witnessed all these things, by the time he's writing this, his friend Peter and his friend Paul were both executed by Nero. And through all that bloodshed and all that loss and all of that chaos that we can't even begin to imagine, John never lost hope. He never lost faith. In fact, at the end of his gospel, in John 20 and verse 30, here's what John writes. He said, Jesus performed many other signs because he had filled this gospel with signs and wonders that Jesus had done. 7 specific signs. And he says, so Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not even recorded in this book. In other words, I'm just giving you a taste. I'm just scratching the surface of what we experience with Jesus. And then he says this in verse 31. But these are written that you may believe. In other words, the only reason that I'm even writing this gospel, and this is what I'm leaving with you, is that I'm hoping that after you read Jesus' life, that you simply won't be impressed or be amazed. But I'm writing this so that you can believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life. He's not talking about physical life, because everybody reading this obviously has physical life, but that you may have a different kind of life in his name. That in spite of what John had seen and what he had smelled, in spite of what he had experienced at the end of his life, with the destruction of everything important to him and the loss of pretty much everybody that was important to him, John still believed that Jesus was the source of some type of life that went beyond physical. And so when he begins his gospel, this is the end, but when he begins his gospel, he doesn't begin with the birth narrative. You see, when Jesus was crucified and as he was dying, he looked down and he saw John and he said, John, I want you to take Mary, my mom, as your mother. And Mary, mom, I want you to take John as your son. And so how much time John and Mary spent together, we don't know. Some reports say that they eventually left and went to Ephesus and that he took care of her till she died. But the one thing we know is that John had to have heard over and over and over the birth story. And if anybody had the opportunity to say, Mary, tell me what it was like. What was it like when you discovered you were pregnant? What did you feel when the angel appeared? Mary, what was it like to know that you bore the Son of God? See, he had to have heard the story over and over and over. He was the person that took care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And yet, when he begins his gospel, he doesn't begin with shepherds or a manger or a star, Egypt. He doesn't begin with Herod and the slaughter of children, little boys in Bethlehem. He begins with the significance of the birth of Jesus. And just like there were very, very dark days when John wrote this gospel, he was reminded that Jesus was born in a time that was very dark as well. And when he sat down to start his gospel, before he got into the narrative and the stories and the details, here's what he said. And this is so powerful. In John begins his gospel in John 1:4. This is his birth narrative. This is how he writes it. And he says, in him, Jesus, in him was life. Not physical life, but John is trying to put it into words. See, he's got all this experience and he's had all this time to think about it and all this perspective. And he's seen things come and go, people be born and die, the destruction of everything important. And he summarizes. And he says, when I think about Jesus, the best way to put it that I know is to say, in him was life. And that life was the light of all mankind. And see, this was a huge statement in that day, because when Jesus showed up on the planet, listen, if you begin to view Jesus as a Jewish Messiah, what the Jews thought that was just going to be regional, that what Jesus would do was just for Israel, it was just for the Jews, that what he was going to do was the continuation of the Old Testament. And John sits back and he says, I realize now that Jesus didn't simply come for us. He didn't simply come for the Jews. What he came for was all mankind. That he brought an element of life and light that was for all mankind. You see, John was there the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And they gathered everybody together and they asked Jesus, now is now the time when you're going to restore the kingdom back to Israel? Is now the time? That you're going to restore the nation out of occupation from the Romans? Are we going to run the Romans out of here now and establish our independence as a nation? And John was there when Jesus said, that's none of your business. This is so much bigger than that. And he said, this is why you're here, is that you're supposed to go into every nature and share with every ethnic group, every culture, every people, what you've seen and what you've heard. You are to make disciples of all nations. You see, this light is not just a Jewish light. This is a light. I am a light, Jesus would say, for all mankind. And then he says this. This is my favorite part. Listen. He's starting off his gospel, and this is the introduction. And he says, and the light shines in the darkness. And I imagine that he thought about the darkness around him. You know, the darkness that, once again, we can't even begin to imagine. And he says, in spite of everything that's happened, everything that has died, been executed, crucified, everybody that's taken away, in spite of the fact that the entire Jewish nation is pretty much out of commission at this point, the temple, the sacrificial system of the temple is dead and never to be restarted, by the way, that everything he had grown to love is gone. In spite of that, he says this, that this light shines in the darkness. In spite of all that. And then he says this, and the darkness has not... And I wonder if he paused. Listen, everybody understand what it means for the light to shine in the darkness and to expose what was in the darkness. But this light of Christ, this light of Jesus, it shines in the darkness, and it is as if the darkness, as hard as it tries to put this light out, to snuff it out, to overwhelm it, to imprison it, to understand, as hard as it is, as hard as it seems that the world and our culture tries to snuff out this light, John says that the darkness has not overcome it. See, this is a man that got news that the Apostle Paul had been executed, that Peter had been executed, and perhaps he was the last apostle alive. And so maybe with a grin on his face, I think he wrote, in spite of everything that this world has tried to do to eradicate the light that is life, the darkness has not overwhelmed it. It has not put it out. It has not overcome it. Caesar couldn't do it. Tiberius couldn't do it. Nero couldn't do it. The destruction of the temple couldn't do it. The very death of Jesus himself could not do it. Because again, this is John that raced to the tomb the day that he heard that the tomb was empty. This is the same John that raced to that tomb, and eventually John peered into that tomb, into that empty tomb. The same John that had breakfast with a risen Savior days later on the beach. The same John that was absolutely convinced that no matter what happened in his life, and no matter what we face in this life, and how deep the heartache, how extreme the fear, and how deep the depression, that there is a light that shines in darkness. And that there is no amount of darkness, there is no type of darkness that can put it out. So at Christmas, when we are confronted, as maybe no other time of the year, when we're confronted with the fact that maybe there are hurts and wounds that are still not healed, that no matter how much we try or forgive people, the hurt is still there. Maybe you've lost a loved one and there's still a big gaping hole. That we're confronted with those facts face to face during the holidays. And maybe there are expectations that you're never going to meet. Just like maybe we're the people that set expectations that we expect others to meet. And that there are situations that maybe we're never going to understand, no matter how hard we try, no matter how hard it's tried to explain, that there are going to be people that are just not going to understand our situation. No matter how hard they try, they don't have the reference points that we have. They don't have the history we have. And so we're reminded that even through all that darkness, that Jesus is life and light who overcomes darkness. That there's always hope. that there's always a reason to believe, that there is always a God that hears our prayers, and that there is a reason to wake up every single morning and take the next steps. Because God is the light that overcomes darkness in your life and in mine. Would you stand?